Caligula shocked Rome in ways no one could have imagined. From executing his own nephew to committing incest with his sister, his reign turned everyday life into something truly horrible. Let's start with family. Tiberius Gemellus was Caligula's 18-year-old cousin, the other potential heir to the throne. When Caligula became emperor, he adopted Gemellus as his son and heir, calling him "my beloved boy" in public ceremonies. Behind closed doors, it was a different story. Cassius Dio describes how Caligula became convinced that Gemellus was plotting against him. The evidence? Gemellus had been taking cough medicine, and Caligula decided the smell meant his cousin was taking antidotes against poison, clearly preparing to murder the emperor. This wasn't paranoia. This was calculated cruelty. Rather than simply ordering an execution, Caligula made it personal. He summoned Gemellus to the palace, embraced him warmly, and then whispered in his ear exactly how he was going to die. The young man would be forced to commit suicide, but not quickly. He would use a dull blade, cutting slowly while Caligula watched. Picture the scene. An 18-year-old boy, trembling in a marble chamber, holding a knife to his own throat while his adoptive father, the man who'd publicly called him beloved, sat calmly giving instructions on technique. Not too deep at first. I want to see the fear in your eyes. According to Suetonius, Gemellus begged for mercy, reminding Caligula of their childhood together, of the love they'd once shared. Caligula's response? He laughed and told guards to hold the boy steady if his hands shook too much. The execution took over an hour. When it was finished, Caligula had Gemellus's head displayed in the palace as a reminder that family loyalty meant nothing when weighed against imperial pleasure. Rome thought it had seen the worst. They hadn't. What shocked the empire wasn't just that he'd killed his cousin. It was the methodical, intimate cruelty he'd used to destroy someone who trusted him completely. The aftermath was equally disturbing. Caligula ordered that no one could mourn Gemellus publicly. Anyone caught grieving for the young man would face the same fate. He wanted to erase not just his cousin's life, but his memory, turning murder into a tool for psychological control over the entire court. But Caligula's appetite for cruelty wasn't satisfied by private executions. He needed a bigger stage. Romans loved their games, but they kept their violence organized. The arena was for gladiators. Executions belonged in the forum. Your average citizen expected certain boundaries. Caligula demolished those boundaries with systematic creativity. He began hosting what he called special exhibitions, mass executions disguised as entertainment. But these weren't ordinary death sentences carried out efficiently. These were elaborate torture sessions designed to maximize both suffering and spectacle. Herodian describes one particularly horrific day when Caligula ordered every prisoner in Rome's jails to be brought to the Circus Maximus. Not to fight as gladiators. That would have been merciful. Instead, they were divided into categories: old men, young men, women, children. Then Caligula announced a game. The crowd would vote on how each group should die. Picture 250,000 Roman citizens screaming their preferences for torture methods while families were dragged into the arena sand. Crucifixion for the old men, but upside down to make it slower. Wild animals for the young men, but with their tendons cut so they couldn't run. Burning for the women, but starting at the feet to prolong the agony. The children. Caligula saved them for last, forcing parents to watch everything that came before, knowing their sons and daughters would face worse. But here's what made it truly monstrous. Caligula didn't just watch. He provided commentary. Like a sports announcer calling a chariot race, he described each victim's final moments, critiqued their screams, rated their performances. He made death into theater and suffering into entertainment. Suetonius records that these exhibitions could last for days, with fresh prisoners brought in as others died. Food vendors sold snacks, children played in the aisles. The slaughter became so routine that citizens brought cushions for comfort during the longer torture sessions. The emperor even introduced betting on the executions. Citizens could wager on how long victims would survive, which torture method would be most effective, or which animals would kill their prey fastest. Death became a gambling opportunity, turning human suffering into profit margins for the imperial treasury. What's most chilling is how quickly the Roman population adapted to this new normal. Within months, these death spectacles drew larger crowds than traditional gladiatorial games. Citizens who had once been horrified by the sight of blood now cheered for increasingly creative forms of execution. And yet, compared to what came next, this was almost merciful. This wasn't justice or even traditional Roman cruelty. This was industrialized sadism, transforming human death into a recreational activity for a psychopath with unlimited power. The arena, however, was still public. What happened in Caligula's private chambers makes everything we've discussed so far seem almost civilized by comparison. According to multiple sources, Caligula established what amounted to a systematic program of sexual torture targeting Rome's most powerful families. This wasn't random lust. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to break the spirits of potential opponents. Cassius Dio, who was actually serving in the Senate during this period, provides the most disturbing details. Senators would receive imperial invitations to dinner parties that couldn't be refused. They'd arrive with their wives and daughters, expecting an evening of political networking. Instead, they'd find themselves trapped in a nightmare of orchestrated humiliation. Caligula would force senators to watch as their wives were raped by gladiators, slaves, and animals, while he provided detailed commentary on their performance. Daughters were stripped naked and auctioned to the highest bidder among dinner guests, with the understanding that refusal to participate meant execution for the entire family. But the true genius of his cruelty lay in the role reversal. Distinguished senators who had commanded legions were forced to perform degrading sexual acts, while their colleagues watched and applauded. Military heroes who had conquered territories for Rome were made to dress as women and serve as prostitutes at palace parties. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't just physical violations. They were systematic destruction of everything that defined Roman masculine identity. Men who had built their entire lives around honor and dignity found themselves reduced to trembling victims, complicit in their own family's degradation. What made this even more horrifying was the bureaucratic precision with which Caligula organized these sessions. Palace scribes kept detailed records of who participated, what acts they performed, and how they reacted. These documents served as blackmail material, ensuring that no senator could later oppose the emperor without risking exposure of their humiliation. Herodian describes how palace servants lived in constant terror, never knowing when they might be selected for the emperor's attention. Unlike previous emperors who might abuse slaves impulsively, Caligula approached torture scientifically, experimenting with different methods and documenting the results. He established what amounted to a torture laboratory in the palace basement, complete with specialized equipment and trained operators. Victims were studied like laboratory animals, their pain responses cataloged and analyzed. Some servants were tortured purely for his curiosity about human suffering. Others were killed in elaborate ways designed to test his theories about death and dying. The Historia Augusta hints at even darker practices: human sacrifice. something Romans had banned centuries earlier as barbaric. The victims were chosen not for crimes, but for symbolic value or simply because Caligula found their suffering aesthetically pleasing. What came next made even hardened Romans question their loyalty to the empire. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Caligula began selling access to these sessions. Wealthy Romans could pay enormous sums to witness or participate in the destruction of their political rivals. The emperor had literally monetized human degradation, turning sadism into a luxury commodity for the elite. Among all the horrors Caligula inflicted on Rome, nothing struck deeper at the empire's moral foundations than his systematic violation of his own sisters. This wasn't hidden scandal whispered about in dark corners. This was public policy announced in the blazing light of the Senate floor. Caligula had 3 sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger. All carried the sacred bloodline of Augustus in their veins. All should have been untouchable symbols of Roman virtue. Instead, they became weapons in Caligula's war against civilization itself. The revelation came at a public banquet attended by 300 senators, priests, and foreign ambassadors. The dining hall shimmered with golden lamps and the soft music of lyres. Then Caligula rose, reached for Drusilla's hand, and drew her toward him in a gesture that shattered every law of Rome. "My divine sisters," he announced calmly, "blessed by Jupiter himself to share my bed as Juno shares his." The room froze. Men stared into their wine cups. Women gripped their goblets until their knuckles whitened. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the knowledge that they were witnessing not just scandal, but sacrilege. By invoking Jupiter's mythical marriage to his sister Juno, Caligula transformed incest into religious precedent. He left the Senate trapped between 2 impossible choices: applaud sacrilege or commit treason. They chose survival and applauded, their hollow clapping echoing through marble halls. Drusilla became his primary obsession. He elevated her to share his imperial quarters, exiled her husband to a distant governorship that amounted to political death, and began appearing with her at state ceremonies where she was treated not as sister, but as empress. Their relationship wasn't hidden behind palace walls. Caligula flaunted it deliberately, forcing the empire to acknowledge what everyone could see. During morning audiences where senators presented petitions, Drusilla sat beside the emperor's throne. At religious ceremonies, she served as high priestess. In the imperial box at games, they appeared as husband and wife. What made this particularly twisted was how Caligula used his sister's humiliation as a political weapon. He would describe their intimate moments in graphic detail during Senate sessions, forcing Rome's most powerful men to listen to descriptions of acts that violated every social and religious taboo. When Drusilla became pregnant, Caligula's mania reached its peak. Standing before the assembled Senate, he proclaimed that the child in her womb was no ordinary infant, but the son of a living god, his heir destined to rule both heaven and earth. The senators who had once shaped empires now voted honors for an unborn child conceived through incest and celebrated as divine miracle. Priests offered sacrifices in temples. Citizens were commanded to pray for the health of an infant who represented the complete collapse of Roman moral order. Caligula even commissioned artists to create statues depicting him and Drusilla in intimate poses, which were placed in public squares throughout the empire. Citizens were required to offer prayers and sacrifices before these obscene monuments, forcing the entire population to participate in the worship of incest. But fate intervened. In June 38 AD, Drusilla died suddenly. Some whispered of complications in childbirth, others of poison delivered by hands too weary of shame to endure more. The truth died with her, buried beneath layers of imperial secrecy. Caligula's grief shattered the last fragments of his humanity. He declared Drusilla a goddess, ordered temples built in her honor, and commanded that Roman citizens swear oaths by her divinity. The woman he had destroyed in life became a deity in death, enshrining victimhood itself as state religion. The empire thought they had witnessed the ultimate violation of sacred bonds. They were wrong. For his surviving sisters, Julia Livilla and Agrippina, Drusilla's death brought no relief, only deeper horror. They were now forced to impersonate their dead sister, compelled to wear her garments, speak her words, and embody her spirit during ceremonies that twisted grief into grotesque theater. Everything we've covered happened within Rome's borders, affecting thousands of people. But Caligula's most horrific act threatened to ignite a war that could have consumed the entire Mediterranean world. In 39 AD, riding high on his delusions of divinity, Caligula ordered his statue erected inside the Temple of Jerusalem, the most sacred site in Judaism, commanding all Jews throughout the empire to worship him as a god. To understand this crisis, you need to grasp what the temple meant to ancient Judaism. This wasn't just a religious building, it was the literal dwelling place of God on earth. For over 500 years, no pagan image had been allowed inside its walls. The very suggestion was considered an abomination that would bring divine judgment on the entire world. Caligula didn't care. He was tired of Jewish special privileges that exempted them from emperor worship. The order went to Petronius, Roman governor of Syria. Install the statue by force if necessary. Any resistance was to be crushed with maximum violence. When news reached Jerusalem, the reaction was immediate and absolute. According to Josephus, over 50,000 Jews gathered in the temple courtyard, tearing their clothes and covering themselves with ashes. They weren't protesting. They were preparing to die rather than allow such sacrilege. Delegations of elders traveled to meet Petronius in Antioch. These weren't revolutionaries, but respected community leaders who had spent their lives navigating Roman rule through diplomacy. Now they knelt before the governor with chilling words. "We cannot allow this abomination. If Caesar's statue enters our temple, you will have to build it on a foundation of Jewish corpses. Every man, woman, and child will die first." Picture the scene. Tens of thousands of people, farmers, merchants, scholars, abandoning everything to camp outside the temple, ready to die rather than submit. Children who had never seen war stood beside grandparents, all united in the certainty that some things are worth more than life itself. The crisis spread throughout the Jewish diaspora like wildfire. In Alexandria, riots broke out as citizens chose between apostasy and death. In Babylon, ancient synagogues were abandoned as entire communities prepared for martyrdom. Petronius faced an impossible situation. His orders were clear: install the statue or face execution. But massacring 50,000 religious devotees would ignite uprisings throughout the eastern provinces. The Roman Empire was already stretched thin, with legions committed to frontier wars. A massive Jewish revolt would require troops that simply weren't available. For months, Petronius stalled, sending desperate letters to Rome, describing massive crowds unified by religious conviction stronger than fear of death. Caligula's response revealed his complete madness. He ordered additional statues for synagogues throughout the empire and announced plans to visit Jerusalem personally as a conquering god. He began assembling a massive army for his divine expedition to the east. 3 full legions were recalled from frontier duty. Caligula commissioned siege engines designed to break down temple walls and ordered dozens of golden statues depicting himself as various gods. The world held its breath as Roman generals faced the prospect of genocide against a people whose only crime was refusing to abandon their ancient faith. Jewish communities prepared for martyrdom on an unprecedented scale. Rabbis wrote final prayers. Families said goodbye to children. Entire cities prepared to burn rather than submit. What saved the empire from this catastrophe wasn't diplomacy. It was a praetorian blade sliding between Caligula's ribs. When news of his assassination reached Jerusalem, the crowds that had gathered to die instead wept with relief. The crisis revealed something terrifying about absolute power. How quickly one man's delusions can threaten to destroy civilizations built over centuries. Caligula had nearly triggered a religious war that could have shattered the Roman Empire and eliminated Judaism from the ancient world. Caligula wasn't just a bad emperor. He was proof of how absolute power can turn a man into something far worse than human. These shocking stories show what happens when unlimited authority meets complete madness. Want to know more of these shocking historical stories? Subscribe to never miss one.